All right, so we are working our way through the small catechism, and as part of that, working our way through the Ten Commandments. So you uh, should have a handout that looks like this, but be careful. If you brought back your handout from last week, this is actually the last page of that handout. So if you're looking at it like this, the staple should be in the upper left corner, not the upper right corner. Right? So it'll be page 56, and then keep going to 57, 58, 59, so on, rather than kind of working backwards as you turn to it. So, handout. So we first thing you may have noticed is that we've been taking one commandment at a time. Here we're taking two at a time, and of course there's a very simple reason for that, because they both have to do with the same thing. They both have to do with covenant. What is the difference between the 9th and 10th commandments, though? They're both listed there, but they're kind of merged together in one. It says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, his manservant, or maidservant, ox, or donkey, or anything that is thy neighbor's." Those are the 9th and 10th commandments. What's the difference between what's covered in the 9th commandment and what's covered in the 10th commandment?
Personal property and persons.
Yeah. Or another way of putting it, living things versus non-living things. Right? So the 9th commandment has to do with non-living things, coveting your neighbor's house, which of course, much like daily bread, does not mean only exclusively the house, but their property. And then the 10th commandment has to do with their spouse, with their workers, with animals even, any living thing, because they really are two different things in practice, right? If I'm really jealous of Dave's pickup truck, I can't go whispering to it at night. Come on, you want to be my truck, don't you? You can't entice his truck away in the same way you'd be able to try and take his best friend and try and make it my best friend, or something along those lines. They function very differently, but they're both about covenant. Now, one of the things that we want to wrestle with too before we get into it further is coveting the same thing as wanting? Wanting something? No, not necessarily. They're related, certainly, but they're not the same thing. Is it wrong to want things? No. Wanting is not wrong in and of itself, but coveting is. Right? So how would you express the difference between wanting something and coveting? What do you consider the difference to be?
I mean, wanting something, but covet it. It's a plan on how you can get it. Or
Okay.
to do it in any way you can to get it.
Okay, yeah. I think part of it's wanting to get it any way you can. Yeah. Our more recent recently confirmed. Do you remember how we expressed in class?
Yeah, it's
Close. Yeah. Wanting what you cannot or should not have. Yeah. Usually it belongs to something else, right? It belongs to someone else. But yeah, kind of generally wanting what you cannot or should not have.
Well, or something and you go so far as to steal it. I mean, like from the store. You want something to the store, you steal it. And that's correct.
Yeah. So that's But the key is that it's not yours, and some kind of nefarious means is required in order to get it. Because planning a way to get it, again, that's not bad either in itself, right? If you need it, if you know you're going to need a new car, you start planning on how you're going to purchase a car and those kind of things. But again, this is in the context of things that you cannot or should not have. Right? And it's very similar in some respects to the seventh commandment about you shall not steal, because both involve something that belongs to your neighbor, either a living person, a friend, or spouse, or what have you, or non-living property. So what's the difference between those two? That's part of what Luther digs into, and he does a beautiful job with it here. So as we did last week, we're going through the Large Catechism. This is a copy of Luther's Large Catechism, what he has to say about the 9th and 10th commandments. And so we're going to use this to kind of guide our discussion today. So in that first paragraph at the bottom of page 56 and at the top of page 57, I'll let you read that on your own some other time. He just goes into the kind of the historical context that led to Moses phrasing this command the way that it was phrased. He was addressing a specific group of people, a specific culture at the time, and so in some respects, these commandments reflect that context. Although certainly the fundamental point is true, regardless of time or place or people. But if we take the first full paragraph on page 57, that's where he starts to really dig into the difference between this and the seventh commandment. So, let's start there. Who would be willing to read that first full paragraph there on 57, the paragraph that starts, "Therefore I say they thus interpret it." Who's up for that?
Therefore I say, they thus interpret it, as is right also, although it goes farther than that, that no one think for purpose to obtain another's wife, servant, house and estate, land, meadows, cattle, even with appearance of right or by seemingly proper means, yet with the end to his neighbor. Or above, in the seventh commandment, the vice is forbidden, where one appropriates to himself the possessions of others, or keeps them from his neighbor without right. But here it is also forbidden to take anything from your neighbor, even though you could do so honorably in the eyes of the world, so that no one else could accuse or blame you as though you had gained it by fraud.
So, what does he say is the difference between the seventh commandment and the 9th and 10th commandments? Especially in those last two sentences.
But somebody, if you could take it, if you rightfully take it, you could do it. But it's still wrong.
Yeah, so the seventh commandment, he's saying, addresses kind of more blatant stealing, whether it's holding somebody up at gunpoint, which also includes the fifth commandment, but and stealing from them directly, or breaking into their house, or those kind of practices that are just blatantly wrong. And here he says that the 9th and 10th commandments, these are addressed against stealing in ways that may even be legal. We use a pretense, we put on these pretenses of doing it in a way that makes us look good and honorable. Makes us look perfectly innocent and even entitled to what we have just taken. Roger.
In the option sale, you have a neighbor that he's bidding and you know he really wants it,
Mm-hmm.
but I want it too. Is that right or wrong?
Yeah, what do you think?
Depends on how much you want to sell.
But I don't think that's covered, if it's an auction sale that's open to both of you.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. That doesn't fall strictly under covenant because it's not wanting something you cannot or should not have. The question is, at what point are you not acting in love towards your neighbor by trying to get it, purchase it out from under him? Yeah, I suppose the question is, the comparative needs, right? How much do you need it versus he or she? That's one that I don't know that there's an easy answer there. That's an interesting question, though.
Or if they don't need it, they don't want to do that.
Yeah, that would. Yeah, because really, remember the bottom line for all these commandments is love. How do you sum up the first three commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. How do you sum up the last 7 commandments? Love your neighbor as yourself. So what one word summarizes all 10 of the commandments? love. Yeah. And so that's really the guiding principle. And again, as I mentioned just as an aside in the sermon this morning, not the sort of what's the phrasing I use, but really love the turn of phrase. Anyway, the kind of pathetic love that the world tries to push off on us, but the genuine, true kind of love that's outlined in the Ten Commandments. But that's what he's saying we're getting at here in these commandments is the sort of stealing that puts on a pretense and may even make it perfectly legal to try to seize your neighbor's property. Let's keep going. And he expands that a little bit in the next paragraph. Who's willing to read that next paragraph? Any volunteers?
I think Axel wants to.
Yeah.
He's trying to get his sister to do it, I see that.
It's the one starting off, for we are so inclined.
Okay, for we are so inclined by nature that no one desires to see another have as much as himself, and each one acquires as much as he can, without regard to how another may fare. And yet we all pretend to be godly, adorn ourselves most finely, and conceal our rascality.
Rascality, great word, isn't it? Rascality. Sorry, go ahead.
Resort to an intent adroit devices and deceitful
Artifices.
artifices.
That's putting on a big face, putting on a show, putting on, yeah. Okay.
Such is now our daily motion.
Ingeniously.
Ingeniously.
You got a lot of fun words there, didn't you?
Yeah, big ones.
There you go. Keep going, you got it.
Contrived to be
Contrived, yeah.
as though they were derived from justice. Yeah, he even dared to impertinently refer to it and boast of it, and do not wish to have it called scholarly, but shrewdness, caution in this cause, irrespective of equity or their neighbor's necessity. And in short, whoever is the most expert in cunning finds most help in want and they feel themselves. As themselves say, the lost neighbor, the watchful.
Okay, you didn't
What's
give
the
it,
Latin there?
you didn't give a shot at the Latin, okay. Is it Latin that goes jura subvenium?
Yeah, I know that.
It's just the same thing as the phrase forget. So what does he say is one of the most common tools used by this kind of thief that steals under the 9th and 10th commandments? The law, right? It says that even judges and lawyers end up assisting in this kind of thing. Because even though we desire to have these things, we also pretend to be godly, adorn ourselves most finely, conceal our rascality, make us look like we're not rascals. That's the way we prefer to operate. Very few of us are crass enough to come out and just steal like is mainly covered under the 7th commandment. This is far more subtle and far more hidden, far more cunning.
So, question, the very first statement, well, we are so inclined by nature that no one desires to see another have as much as himself.
Yeah.
And each one acquires as much as he can,
Uh-huh.
without regard to how another may fare.
Mhm.
So, is that saying, okay, is that wrong? Maybe we got it?
So you're talking about Roger's question again, or?
No, I'm talking
Okay.
about, actually, I'm talking about, is it communism, is it, you know, socialist?
Mhm.
Are we supposed to be, are we all in it together?
See, I think it's also capitalist, isn't it? I think there's a fair dose of that in capitalism. Because, regardless of what economic system you're talking about, what's the common denominator in all of them? Money, generally, power, but more basically, the human beings, right? These economic systems don't exist in a vacuum. Right? They're different ways of ordering the way and structuring the way that we relate to each other as human beings. And so the basic problem is not really communism or capitalism or socialism or any other ism. The basic problem is the human heart. That's where really the ultimate problem comes from, because in the early church they had all things in common. I'm sure that's probably one of the arguments used in favor of communism. See, in the early church, the church even teaches that this is how we should function, having all things in common, rather than people claiming personal property, that sort of thing. Scripture does not lay out a specific economic plan. What it lays out is the problem of sin in the human heart, and thankfully addresses that, so that whatever structure we're working within, we act in a loving way rather than selfishly. Does that address what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Or start to? What would you like to push back on it, or dig into a little further? What else about
It was
that?
just, just a question. I mean, okay, so, are we doing it wrong by, am I supposed to help others be equal to me? Yeah? If when I work, I made $50,000 a year and the neighbor made 25, was I supposed to pool resources and, we both made half of that?
I think the way you phrase that is really interesting. To make sure that your neighbor is equal to you. Is that what?
Well, then
you're
I'm
saying
not
here?
trying to be ahead of him.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to get more than him. And it says human nature says we want to do that. Should I want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have this sinful nature that is jealous if others have more than we do. I think that's more what this is speaking to. And I suppose conversely, that doesn't care about those who don't have enough. Looks down on them as something less. I mean, if you're no longer talking to your neighbor because you make $100,000 a year and they're still making $25,000 a year, that's a problem. And that goes again. The problem goes beyond the money.
So I don't have to feel guilty if I do better than the neighbor.
Well,
No.
because God blesses some in one way and blesses others in other ways.
And I guess I don't need guilty, but obligated, more obligated to help than.
Okay, that's another issue. You're asking me. Phrasing is really wonderful. Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Another thing is you earn, like you work and you earn to get your things. Where when you're covenant, where I'm just sitting here and I'm like, no, I'm not.
You owe it to me.
You
Yeah.
owe it to me. You know what I mean? Like you're looking at the opposite side where like, no, you earned it. Like you still earned it, you worked for it. It'd be one thing if you were
If you stole it,
if
and then
you
you're like,
right, or if if you still made your 50,000 and you only had 25,000, but you had a nicer this house is blue and you're like, I want this house is blue. You know what I mean? Because you didn't earn that. You know what I mean? Is that kind of makes sense?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Yeah.
But if you find out your neighbor is in,
Want that you don't rightfully own or should.
I was gonna
Protect
say,
your heart.
yeah,
Yes.
your intent too.
if you find out if your neighbor is in dire need, you would never turn your back on him. I mean, you never do.
I think the key word you use there is obligation. What is your obligation to your neighbor? To love them. Now that can look different in different circumstances. But does it mean that you make sure they have as much as you do in every sense?
No, I don't believe that.
No. At the same time, like you said, if they're in dire need, then we certainly
You never turn your back on him.
we do have an obligation to them.
Interesting that they never really seem to covet how hard someone works for something, or how much sacrifice was put into that,
Right.
or how much struggle that person went through. You know, they want the end of the.
I suppose that's part of what is being addressed here. You could have much of what we covet. We could have much of what we covet if we chose it, and in some cases, if we put in the effort. There are certainly a lot of cases where, people genuinely do not have the opportunities that we have. So we have to, kind of be careful not to fall off into the other extreme either. But that is one of the ways, like you said earlier, planning to get things. That means that we're not coveting. We are we're wanting something, working toward it, which is, there might still be concerns about greed more generally, more broadly, but that itself is not wrong. Yeah, I love the way you phrase it. Our obligation to our neighbor. That's really the central question.
There's also the thought of obligation versus blessing. If you think about it from the aspect of time, talent, and treasure, and then you think about the fact that you can't outgive the Lord. So maybe you don't have an obligation, but if you go that extra step, go that extra mile, and give and give and give, the tendency is God blesses that, right? He likes it.
Yeah. So, generosity is toward our neighbor always an expression of healthy expression of that love that we're commanded to have. But again, a lot of this depends on specific circumstances. That's why it becomes so difficult to give just a blanket answer on a lot of these questions, because it can depend on circumstances, not just outward circumstances, but even the condition of your heart, the condition of their heart. Even if they are in need, there's some people where you can give and it's just going to be, it's going to run through their fingers. It's going to be wasted. There is a place for allowing people to feel the consequences of their action. I've known a lot of parents who dealt with this with children, with their grown children. Sometimes you have to let them feel the consequences of their actions. That's just the reality.
It's funny how, it's kind of like this, Danny said, blessed, whatever, but I'm pretty close to him that I do a lot of hunting fishing. He was saying, like, I don't want to say this person, but I got a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like, I tell him, I said, hey, use this, use that, no. And finally I come to him and I said, hey, listen, the Lord's blessing. Let me pass that on.
Yeah.
Look at it that way. Don't look at it as using something you don't think you should.
Yeah.
We're already blessed.
And that's a fantastic way to express it. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, it almost bothers you when people don't. I don't know if I would go out and use it, whatever. And it kind of hurts your feelings sometimes if they won't.
Yeah.
But the people are different.
Yeah, there are some people who are they are determined to do it without any help, and so again, there are all sorts of different factors, both external factors and also within our hearts as well.
It's also like that Vigobi commercial on TV where everybody's walking down the street to lose weight. That makes a lot of sense.
I don't think they've seen that for a while.
Wasn't on YouTube.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's working.
I would skip the ads anyway.
Right.
Yeah. But as we were starting off that paragraph, it did bring my mind at least back to the question you asked, Roger. That we are inclined by nature that no one desires to see another have as much as himself. Each acquires as much as he can. So I think that kind of comes back to, or at least relates to the question you posed about, okay, if you're bidding against somebody else, is that a sinful act of trying to pile up more and more stuff for yourself? And like we touched on, it certainly could be, but not necessarily. Yeah.
What about the labor market in general? I mean, obviously, if you want that employee, you bid a few little bucks than he's making now, you probably get it. I mean, is that covered?
And what is the, open your catechism, what's the meaning of the 10th commandment?
Agreed. Sneak them away is the word, right?
Entice away our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals, or turn them against him, but urge them to stay and do their duty. So, that's That's another really good question when it comes to this commandment. Because on the one hand, yeah, you certainly want really good and skilled and hardworking employees. At what point are you sinning against the eighth commandment by enticing away someone else's worker?
So what's the answer?
Like we talked about in the past, that's yeah.
Well, I gave Pastor Reed on that a couple
What's that?
years ago. About just that.
Oh, okay.
Employees.
Mhm.
And his state that there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, if every employee stayed with their employer, what would be the incentive to give them raises? Like, all employees would not be treated well, because, oh, I have to stay here because I don't, that employee's not covering me. I don't know, that's part of fair
And
market.
how is it different with the employees and the ones treated? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
The
like
employee comes to you
employees
and
might
says,
say, hey, I
job.
would like a better job.
Yeah,
I think
sometimes
it's
you
a
So
slippery
that's the
slope.
intent of your heart. You know what I mean? If your heart is to hurt your neighbor, then it's a sin. If your heart is to help her, then
So it's totally
It's-
innocent.
I would, well,
This
be
is
careful about
innocent.
totally
I
innocent,
think
yeah.
We're covered over Jesus' grace.
Yeah. So, what is, well, I mean, let's kind of turn it around too. What is that employee's obligation? What is that employee's relationship with his current employer? Is he bound to that employer forever? No. So the understanding is that he works, they work together as long as it suits both of them, and there may be a yearly contract or some contract along those lines that defines terms, but generally the understanding is that he still has the ability, the right to take his work elsewhere. And even what you suggested, trying to hire someone else's worker, that their current employer has the opportunity to try to match that or try to
So they do cover it the second time.
So yeah, and that's fine. Yeah.
That was negotiated.
Sure, exactly. But the key thing is that original definition, wanting something we cannot or should not have. There's no reason that you should not have that employee necessarily. Right? If you're able to offer a better work situation, whether it's money or flexibility or whatever that person might desire, then that's entirely appropriate. But I think part of what we're getting at is that a lot of this is sort of baked into our just the way we do business, like we've talked about when we're talking about the seventh commandment. So much of this, well, it's just the way the world works. Right? That's just business. That's just good business. And you're not wrong to be pushing back against some of those ideas, because we need to be careful. Where do those ideas come from? Where do those understandings come from? Where's that worldview come from? Does it come from Scripture, or does it come from the world around us and our own sinful heart? Let's keep going. Paragraph bottom of 57 to the top of 58. Who's willing to read that? It's a little bit shorter one. It starts, "This last commandment, therefore." Who's willing to read that one?
This last commandment, therefore, is given not for works in the eyes of the world, but just for the most pious, who praise and become honest, public people who have not offended against the former commandments, as especially the Jews claim to do, and even now for many noblemen, gentlemen, and princes. For the other common masses belong yet farther down under the seventh commandment, as those who do not ask how they may acquire the possessions with honor and might.
Okay. So, what a beautiful way of describing it. This commandment is addressed especially to the just and the most pious, right? The most outwardly good people, right? Who use very subtle ways, nonetheless, of trying to get what they want.
Good in their own mind.
Good in their own minds, yeah. Or outwardly, yeah. Let's keep going. Continue that thought. Next paragraph, who's willing to read that one?
This occurs principally in litigations, where it is the purpose to get something from our neighbor and to eject him from his possessions. As, to give examples, when people quarrel and wrangle for a large inheritance, real estate, etc. They avail themselves of and resort to whatever has the appearance of wealth, so dressing and adorning everything that the law must favor therefrom, and they keep possession of the property with such title that no one can make complaint or lay claim thereto. In like manner, if anyone desire to have a castle, city,
Duchy, I think is what that is.
or any other great thing, he practices so much financiering through relationships and by any means he can that another is deprived of it, and it is judicially declared to be his, and confirmed with deed and seal as acquired honestly and by princely title.
So we need to mail a copy of this to Washington D.C.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this gets back to the point we're just making. There's so many ways in which this is just the way the world works. I heard somebody once argue that part of the reason that the CEOs of these big companies are earning so much is because they have the opportunity to lobby Congress and lobby the president to put into place regulations that will kind of protect their business by making it harder for other businesses to get started, for others to compete. I don't know how true that is, to what extent that's true, but that would certainly be an example of what we're talking about here. But again, yeah.
It reminds me of Lot and Abraham when Abraham's like, you pick first, and take whatever land you want, and I'll pick second. And it's like complete opposite of
Yeah.
what we would do today, and still Abraham was blessed even though he didn't get the best land the first time.
He ended up far better on that deal, didn't he?
Yeah.
Lot ended up losing everything in the end.
It's hard to think that way. It's
It
hard
is,
to
yeah.
you just go, you take it.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's fantastic of that. I mean, again, I love the Bible stories of how those things, I mean, God shows us.
That was like one of my first Sunday school lessons was teaching that, and Gail has always stuck with me, even
Yeah.
though I don't want to do it. Like, I don't want to let people pick apart. I'm always reminded of it.
And in that case especially, in Abraham's case especially, there was a really profound statement of faith there too. How was that a statement of faith on
He
Abraham's?
trusted God to bless him with what he needed.
That's right. He knew he had God's promises, and he trusted those to the point that, all right, I'm not relying on myself, my own cleverness, my own grasping to prosper. God is going to provide, and so I will happily give you the first choice, and God will bless whichever half I end up with. Yeah. So yeah, just the action itself, the choice itself is a good example, but the faith beneath it is also important. Yeah.
But like your financial consultant would be like, don't do that. That's stupid. You need to do the financially right thing to do.
Yeah. And then here we're kind of circling around the difference between Christian stewardship and just normal worldly stewardship, right? We come at it with the understanding that everything we have comes from God. We're responsible to Him for it, and He's ultimately the one who will provide. And it really is like I said, it's a very freeing way to start. You're not necessarily in competition with everybody else. You are trusting yourself to God. It's part of what. Yeah. And it's part of why we give offerings. It's a statement, as a reminder that this is where it came from, and as a testimony of that, I'm giving back a portion of what God has given to me. Let's keep going. Next paragraph, likewise also in common trade. Who's up for reading that one?
Likewise also in common trade, where one dexterously slips something out of another's hands, so that he must look after it, or surprises and defrauds him in what he regards as his advantage and benefit. The latter cannot regain or redeem it without injury, debt, or perhaps distress. For the former gains the half, or even more, and yet this must be considered as acquired by fraud or stolen, but
Must not be considered.
not be considered. Honestly, what? Here they say, the first is the best, but everyone must look to his own interest. Let another get what he can. And who can be so wise as to think of all that one can get into his possession by such pretext?
Oh, yeah, specious, sorry.
This the world does not consider wrong and will not see that the neighbor is thereby put to a disadvantage and must sacrifice what he cannot spare without injury. If there is no one who wishes this to be done him, in which they can easily perceive that such device and appearance are false.
Like this is another one where it's striking to me how often he comes up. Yeah, it's just like that saying goes. It's just like the saying goes. It's just like the saying goes. Again, reflecting the fact that so much of this is simply how the world works. So again, it's I think part of the value of these commandments especially is the reminder to kind of step back and observe, examine some of our basic assumptions of how things should be, our basic assumptions of what's normal, of what's right, and what's acceptable. Where do those come from? Are they from Scripture? Has the Holy Spirit taught you these things, or has the world taught them to you? Has your own sinful flesh taught them to you? There's arguably a lot more of that within the church in our day than being guided by Scripture, unfortunately. So those all focused on non-living property. Now he also does touch on living beings. Right? So let's read through that, and I think there are probably some cultural things we can pick apart here and pick on. But let's see if we can take something edifying from it. Who's up for reading that next paragraph? Thus was the case formerly.
Thus was the case formerly also with respect to wives. They were skilled in such devices that if one were pleased with another woman, he himself or through others, as there were many ways and means to be thought of, caused her husband to conceive some displeasure toward her, or had her resist him, and so seductively felt that he was obligated to dismiss her. That sort of thing undoubtedly prevailed much under the law, as also we read in the Gospel of King Herod, that he took his brother's wife while he was yet living, and yet wished to be thought as honorable, pious man, as St. Mark also testifies of him. But such an example, I trust, will not be found among us, because in the New Testament, those who are married are forbidden to divorce, except in the case of whether one shrewdly by some stratagem takes away a rich bride from another. But it is not a rare thing with us that one estranges or entices another away another man's servant or maidservant, or allures them by flattering words.
Yeah. So, kind of back up to the beginning of that paragraph. I think the translation is a little bit misleading. The first word of the second sentence there is they were skilled. I don't think it's saying that the wives were skilled. I think it's referring back to the first paragraph that we skipped over, where husbands were skilled in devices that if he was pleased with another wife, he could put away his current wife and pursue that other woman. I think that's what I understand this to be saying. I didn't want to give any wrong impressions there. But this is the flip side of it, getting back to your question about enticing away someone else's workers. And again, in Luther's day, a little bit different relationship between workers and employers than we have today. So part of it is just the culture of context, and kind of keeping these commandments within that context. So let's go one quickly. These last two paragraphs. Who's able to read the first full paragraph on page 59 that starts off, "In whatever way such things happen"?
Whatever way such things be, just know that God was not with deprive your neighbor of anything that belongs to him. That he suffered a loss, and you would gratify that mercy
Avarice, it's another word for greed.
with it, even if you could command it outwardly before the Lord. For it is a secret and the scandal
Dastardly, yeah, that's a more common
of
word.
those practiced under the disguise that it may not be known. For although you go your way as if you had done no one any wrong, you have nevertheless injured your neighbor. And if it is not stealing and cheating, it yet is desiring your neighbor's property, that is, aiming at possessions of it, enticing you away from him without his will, and being unwilling to see him enjoy what God has granted. And although the judge and everyone must leave you in possession of it, yet God will not leave you therein. For he sees the deceitful heart and the malice of the world. Wherever you yield to her fingers, rather, is sure to take an L.
I don't know what that word is referring to here. I don't know if that was a amount of money or what it was, but I think you get the general sense.
And public law and violence.
Yeah, thank you. So here we come back again to the key point, which is the greed that is behind all of this. Even though it's dressed up in very pious, very godly looking clothing, if you will, these are sins because of the greed that is behind it. And so two thoughts about that really quickly because we're running out of time. First is, again, this is a reminder that desires themselves can be sinful. Often we, in a good-hearted attempt to try to distinguish, how we deal with people, we distinguish between the temptation, the desire, and then the action. Right? The action is sinful, but the feeling itself is not. Right? Well, that's true in some sense. The devil does tempt us, and that temptation itself is not a sin. However, desires themselves can be sinful, like in the case of the greed here, or hate in the case of the fifth commandment, lust in the case of the sixth commandment. These desires themselves can be sinful. They are in fact twisted by sin. The other part of it is getting back to the question that you asked, Mike, about do you have an obligation to make your neighbor equal to you? I think part of what he said here kind of triggered a thought in my head, and that kind of, let's take the question you asked and flip it around. If you are that neighbor, if you are the poorer neighbor, do you have an obligation for your richer neighbor to share with you, to make him equal to you, or make you equal to him? Yeah, but I don't think there's any obligation that we can put on. And in fact, I think that would be very much what is being forbidden here, the greed, the coveting that is being forbidden. For
So I
that.
think what catches me there is it says no matter what this social rulings law says, God's gonna hold it against you. Did you catch that?
Yeah, good point.
If we can test wills and so forth or whatever, and kinda slyly get some stuff away.
Yeah, God is not going to, you're not going to get before God on Judgment Day and he's going to start taking the task and he's saying, well, it was all legal, right? And that's not going to absolve you, right, is it? That's a great point. It may be perfectly legal, it does not mean that it's not sinful. Yeah. Very good.
Or it also says, don't deprive anything your neighbor that belongs to him. He had earned it, so you don't want that also.
And there again, if your neighbor says, I want the second car, that doesn't mean you give it to him. If your neighbor doesn't have food on his table, you'll take him food. The wants and the needs are different.
And then let's conclude with the other half of that, which which is not just forbidding the greed, the coveting here, but also the positive desires for our neighbor. Let's wrap up with that last paragraph there. Who's willing to read that last one? Therefore we abide.
Therefore we abide by the common sense of these commandments, that in the first place we do not desire our neighbor harm, nor even assist nor give occasion for it, but gladly leave and see him in the enjoyment of his own, and besides advance and preserve for him what may be for his profit and service, as we should wish to be treated. Thus these commandments are especially given against envy and miserable avarice, that God may remove all causes and sources whence arises everything by which we do injury to our neighbor. And therefore he expresses it in plain words, thou shalt not covet. For he would especially have the heart pure, although we shall never attain to that as long as we live here, so that this commandment, like all the rest, will constantly accuse us and show how ungodly we are in sight of God.
And that's a perfect place to wrap up, because the point of all this, each of these commandments, is to hold up the mirror of God's law in front of us, and so that we can take a good, honest look and realize exactly what we look like spiritually speaking. See our sin more clearly and our need for God's grace, so that we can rejoice at receiving that grace that relates back to the readings today, but hearing that condemnation, that accusation of God's law, so that we know how beautiful and what an amazing gift we have in the gift of Jesus Christ. All right, any last thoughts there? Another great discussion. Thank you for that. Yeah. All right. God's blessings in your week.